Fashion has always been a reflection of a larger cultural zeitgeist within America. From the flapper trends of the Roaring '20s to the indie sleaze of the 2010s, fashion has served as an artistic culmination of American art, attitude, and politics. I pride myself on my fashion and fascinated by the ideas of trend cycles as well as the seemingly random trends that seem to grab America by the horns. During the pandemic, there was an emergence of different aesthetics and as social groups, colloquially referred to as cores, like in essence, cottagecore, gorbcore, fairycore. These whole aesthetic groups trending marked the beginning of the tendencies of people to associate visual aesthetics with certain traits beyond physical markers like clothing or makeup, music taste. Participants in cottagecore were people who likely crocheted or knitted. People who adopted the e-boy or e-girl aesthetic were known to drink Monster Energy drinks and in the time of 2020 to be viscerally politically active. But these distinctions among aesthetics have petered out a bit, and the cultural pendulum swings more towards generalized stereotypes for a wider range of aesthetics. I'm interested in how these aesthetic adoptions have morphed into one melting pot of a category and how those associations with non physical traits have melded into one larger phenomenon. In recent times, there seems to be a growing interest in country aesthetics, more country music, and a longing for the rustic simplicity of country living, or at least the idea of it. I want to explore how a shift in country music and fashion has come together to fight back against the historical conservatism associated with country music, aesthetics, and life in light of increasing bipartisanship. So, music and politics are two interlinked cultural staples. It's nearly impossible to talk about political events without bringing up the subsequent art creation and vice versa. Musicians have been using the musical mediums to convey their opinions and ideologies for decades, like Loretta Lynn in the 60s with her song The Pill. Her song about the empowerment of birth control was so controversial for the time, and because of her previous history of non activism, that some country music stations refused to play her song. In an NPR podcast, political editor and correspondent Ron Elving said, of all the proto feminist songs, this was probably the least likely because Loretta Lynn was not associated with any kind of hippiness or kind of left wing West Coast San Francisco, all that 1960s stuff from the late 60s. She wasn't even from the folk tradition, really. The folk tradition that is very closely related to country music, but had a strong left populist, even radical tradition politically, associated with people like Woody Guthrie, for example. Or in the later 2000s, when the Dixie Chicks protested George W. Bush in the Iraq War, they had people burning their CDs and they were blacklisted from country radio, persona non grata in Nashville, according to Elving. In a Science Direct article by Brianna and Mack and Teresa R. Martin, they cite preliminary research that suggests that there could be a connection between political ideologies and the liking specific genres of music, noting that this research is relatively outdated. The article looks to explore the relationship between music preference, partisanship, and political attitudes as they theorize that affective polarization is no longer regulated to the areas of elections, policy preferences, news media consumption, and other political areas. They think that this theory of polarization is also present in musical preferences as an extension of one's identity. As such, people prefer music that closely aligns and reaffirms their own personal identity, beliefs, and ideologies because they find comfort in the reflection of what they already know. The more a person subscribes to a particular political party, the more likely they are to listen to music that perpetuates and supports their identity in a bout of reaffirmation of personal identity. As a disclaimer, Mack and Martin are looking at research around how political polarization affects opposing attitudes and preferences as the different patterns and origins of music, but they acknowledge that there's no concrete knowledge of a direct relationship between political polarization and musical genres that have stark sonic differences. With polarization, emotions are a key driver, and as for affective polarization, it refers to the increase in negative feelings between two opposing political parties. So, Mack and Martin propose that negative feelings are bred via music, to put it simply. Which brings me to country music. Country music is a historically conservative music genre, but that wasn't always the case. Nick Shoulders, an up-and-coming country singer-songwriter from Arkansas, says of country music, although it was born in the shadow of slavery and the Trail of Tears, country music was a working-class tradition that reflected and often challenged an oppressive reality. The heart of the country tradition, Shoulders says, is an unwillingness to back down from expressions of joy and camaraderie. and an insistence on selfless love for one another. One of the reasons country music became so popular is because of its connection to historic America. Country music as a genre incorporates folk, blues, and rock elements, all quintessentially American genres. Though the music industry is ever evolving, the country music genre has stayed relatively stagnant. Trends come and go, of course, but many artists stick to the formula laid out by previous country icons who were wildly successful, like Johnny Cash. Country music tends to be generally more wholesome, leaning into the idyllic and rustic life of the country, removed from the stress of the city and soul-sucking urban life. The notable new interest in country music comes as no surprise, as society displays media and internet burnout, rebellion against major corporations, and pushback against the traditional 9 to 5 American dream. While country has remained the same in general, that's not to say that there haven't been major changes within the past couple years. Rising star Jelly Roll had the 10th most popular country song in February of 2024. Jelly Roll is an artist heavily inspired by Leonard Skinner, a country rock band who respectively took inspiration from folk and blues music, according to Phoenix FM. In 2019, Lil Nas X topped the Billboard Hot 100 charts for 17 weeks straight, beating out Mariah Carey's record for 16 weeks for One Sweet Day with his collaboration with Billy Ray Cyrus for his song Old Town Road. Just this year, artist Shaboozey set a record for 17 weeks atop the Hot 100 for a record with no accompanying credits with his song A Bar Song, Tipsy, bleeding out Morgan Wallen's record for 16 weeks with Last Night in 2023. These contemporary country songs have not only included more rap elements, but are also top charting songs by Black, and in the case of Lil Nas X, queer artists in a white dominated genre and industry. With traditional country music, ideas of the nuclear family, rural living, and authenticity are associated with Southern life, and these ideas are constantly perpetuated. In one article that Mac and Martin review, they cite that it was found that white people who enjoy country music do so because it primes nostalgic feelings for traditional family life and values. And even though country music is not always political, it became linked to conservatism and helped form the mentality and values of an entire group of people through a return to simplicity, moral clarity, and small-scale rural communities. Music is known to be a reflection of societal, cultural, and group identities, and in extension of that, genres are often thought to represent different groups of music with different styles, message, and sonic tenets. Thus, drastic genre differentiation can then be taken to say that different genres of music represent opposing cultures and ideas through the lens of bipartisanship. In an age so concerned with other people's perceptions of oneself, the tendency for people to then search for authenticity to validate themselves is a sure thing. Science Direct mentions a study that show music listeners to be highly sensitive not only to musical content as in lyrics, but also finding solidarity within the song's purpose and then imbuing it with their own intentions that ultimately encourage those listeners to prefer that specified genre because it supports and validates their identities and beliefs. As I said earlier, music is a continuous and stable aspect of a culture. However, there are certain rules that music genres must follow in order to be accepted by the social groups within a culture. Humans are creatures of habit. They prefer consistency, and from which it can then be inferred that individuals who prefer a certain type of music prefer it because it reflects who they think themselves to be and the environment they are used to. Mac and Martin write, humans are pattern-seeking, self-affirming beings. The innate desire to seek out like-minded individuals, whether it is family members who align politically with us or musicians who describe the very things that we struggle to articulate ourselves, is the driving force behind divisions and political polarization, especially in the United States. This drive to find community is not just tied to music preferences. People use fashion and clothing as a way of expressing themselves and their beliefs as well. In an article published by Medium, writer under the pseudonym Bold Designer Minds states that fashion has long been recognized as a form of communication, conveying various messages about social status, identity, and cultural values. However, beyond these more individualistic expressions, fashion also has the potential to communicate broader political ideologies, from the colors and symbols used in garments to slogans and messaging associated with certain brands. Fashion has the power to communicate political beliefs, and it's able to do so in a way that is both powerful and accessible to a broader audience. For example, The writer cites a specific simple t-shirt with a political slogan can convey a message to anyone who sees it, regardless of their cultural background or level of education. This accessibility is what makes fashion a potent tool for political messaging. With music and fashion being so closely tied to self-identity and wrapped in individuals' ideologies and personal expression, it can be inferred that people search for fashion that aligns with their individualistic identity. In applying our previous discussion of affective polarization with music to that of fashion, the two opposing parties amp up negative feelings between the two and subscribe to opposing aesthetics in an effort to differentiate themselves from the other party. Fashion has been used as a political statement for ages, literally. In ancient Greece, the draping of fabric that Chitons and Himatians took advantage of was used as symbols of democracy and freedom, both values deeply important to Greek society and culture. Similarly, in Rome, the toga was a garment reserved for citizens, becoming a symbol of Roman citizenship and identity. In France, during the French Revolution, the aristocracy's ornate and lavish clothing was in sharp contrast with the practical clothing worn by the bourgeoisie and working class. The robes à la François of the wealthy were seen as a symbol of aristocratic excess, and the revolutionary tricolor cockade was worn as a symbol of support for the revolution and in support of social change. Domestically, in the 1920s and 30s, designer Coco Chanel's androgynous designs were seen as a rejection of the traditional gender roles, and in the 1950s, designer Christian Dior's ultra-feminine designs were a celebration of femininity and a rejection of the austerity of wartime. With the punk movement in the 70s and 80s, Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren used fashion to express their anarchist beliefs and highlight causes that they strongly believed in. Fashion in recent years, similarly to music, has trended towards authenticity, championing the individuality of personality. Similar to the listener's uncanny discernment of artists' subliminal messaging, consumers today are highly attuned to corporate and social responsibility and are more likely to support transparent brands about their values and actions, right? This search for authenticity ravages microtrends as Gen Z aims to discern what is authentic, what is selling out, and what is cool. Like most social phenomena, and similar to the necessary adherence to certain rules within genres to be accepted by the wider society, Gen Z fashion has many an unspoken rule that must be followed for fear of being out of trend or seen as unauthentic. For example, with the trend of camouflage or camo print in fashion, there are variations of the print with varying degrees of acceptance. With this search for respite from the dredges of urbanity to be dramatic, Gen Z has taken to adopting Western wear, country music, even country slang, the rise of y'all in everyday language. The reclamation of country music is slow but steady, but has seen no other accelerant for the reclamation that matches that of Chappell Roan. With her hit debut album, The Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess, listeners fell in love with Roan's Midwestern longing for party-popping LA stardom, interlaced with the now nostalgic club feel and her maximalist drag queen aesthetic. Calling back to her Midwestern roots, Chappell Roan released merchandise for her album in the form of a camel print hat with orange lettering that reads Midwest Princess. The hat takes inspiration from popular hunting brand Realtree. Realtree camo clothing is one of the prime marks of a larger camo trend, what started ironically because no one in metropolitan areas is duck hunting genuinely, has turned into a larger trend of wearing camo clothing in a reclamation of a typically Southern conservative style. When Kamala Harris announced Tim Walz as her vice president running mate for the 2024 presidential election, the campaign was quick to drop merch in the form of a familiar-looking camo print hat with orange lettering. The thing about trends is that they must be done precisely right, or the greater public will figure out any hidden or unintentional inauthenticity behind it. As for the Harris Walz hat, the plain sans serif font is too lackluster. The camel print is too plain. Even the shape of the hat. The Harris Walz design is leaning towards flat bill fitted hat territory rather than the sleek baseball hat silhouette that is now trending. You may be thinking that harping on the font being lackluster is being too nitpicky, but take a look at Charlie XCX's Brat merch. Her font is plain Arial. Grainy, pixelated, low-quality Arial at that. The difference between the two, as Charlie XCX's branding was wildly successful, is authenticity. The greater media and Charlie XCX fans see her branding as in line with her indie sleaze background and club rat adolescence. Her current aesthetic embodies the very identity she's been pushing out for as long as she's been on the music scene. I guarantee you, had the Harris Walls hat not said Harris Walls, it would not have sold for reasons previously mentioned. Any person familiar with the camo trend and a fan of Chapel Roan would have been able to discern the somewhat inauthenticity of the design. In an effort to be more authentic and to appeal to younger audiences, as was the theme for their entire campaign, the Harris Walls team fumbled. It's clear that the person who designed the hat and approved the hat actually is unfamiliar with the intricacies of the design and is not versed in the specific rules that must be adhered to in order for it to be accepted by the in-group. It's my opinion that the running mates were likely trying to capitalize on the young Midwestern Gen Zers who haven't specifically been targeted by any major campaigns in recent years, besides the ongoing one of the music industry. But by tapping into Waltz's Midwestern roots, um, perhaps they were not necessarily trying to copy Chapel Roan's merch in the way that Variety article suggested. There is a distinct possibility that the idea was from an intern or campaign member who happened to be a fan of Chapel Roan and had a finger on the pulse of fashion, not for any close-hearted affinity for the Realtree brand on Waltz's part. Both music and fashion have ties or can be classified as ephemera. In his article, Ephemera as Evidence, Introductory Notes to Queer Acts, Professor Jose Esteban Munoz defines ephemera as the traces, residues, and fleeting moments left after performances. These traces challenge traditional notions of evidence in academic inquiry. He writes, I want to take some time to reflect on what I'm calling ephemera as modality of anti-rigor and anti-evidence, far from filtering materiality of cultural studies, reformulates and expands our understanding of materiality. Ephemera, as he is using it here, is linked to alternate modes of textuality and narrativity like memory and performance. It is all those things that remain after performance, a kind of evidence of what has transpired, but certainly not the thing itself. It does not rest on epistemological foundations, but is instead interested in following traces, glimmers, residues, and specks of things. He positions ephemera as a counterpoint to formal archives in queer studies, and there's definitely something queer about the overlap between fashion, country, and the Lana Del Reyification of the idea of the Americana, but we don't have time to get into that. I'm looking at ephemera as a pushback to the historical association of all things Southern related. We established earlier that emotions are the drivers of affective polarization and the increasing loyalty to progressively extremist parties. And Munoz echoes this idea with his exploration of Raymond Williams' concept, the structures of feeling. Munoz highlights how emotions, affect, and lived experiences create lasting social and cultural impact. And ephemera is connected to these structures of feeling, offering insight into the ways queer communities generate meaning outside of official codified systems. For our purposes, ephemera still signifies a certain code, but in relation to political partisanship, no one is uh, tracking TikTok trends, and so these fashion moments are often fleeting. With the culture pendulums for Gen Z swinging more country in appearances, tastes, and motivations, and the queer country aesthetic is becoming more synonymous with left leaning partisanship. Clearly, fashion and music trends can tell you a lot about the social and political climate of a society. Both fashion and music have cult followings, and I predict that we will see a rise not only in nationalism and increasing party polarization, but as a consequence, a continuing readoption of the American aesthetic and a wider expansion in country sonics, all in response to perhaps and potentially un American actions from President elect Donald Trump in his coming term. The paradoxical rise of the historically conservative fashion motifs with left leaning tendencies continues to fascinate me, and I look forward to analyzing future music releases and fashion trends as this cultification of the Americana aesthetic continues to affect Gen Z's partisanship. Thank you.